Hello again, treasure tracers. This is Matt Brewer with my second vlog titled The Authority on What Temperature is Warm Water and Why It Matters. Let's get started. There's a lot to cover here, but I think it'll definitely be worth your time. Alright, so here are some of the arguments against where warm water's halt being at a thermal spring, or at thermal springs in general. The first one is warm is a subjective term, which means that where warm water's halt is not likely a defined place where hot or warm springs mix with the cold water. And also there's the secondary argument, which is we can't point to a place on the map where the mixing waters go from hot to warm to cold. So logically, both appear to be very valid arguments, right? In fact, I've made these very arguments myself. But if they are valid, that means that where warm water's halt at a thermal spring is fairly unlikely. It's a low probability. But, all right, so don't throw out the baby with the warm bath water. There's some counterpoints that we need to talk through. All right? So let's get past the arguments. So logically, in order for warm water halt to be relative to a thermal spring, we need at least one of the following, not one of the following, but one of the following to be true. The thermal spring has warm in its name. Thus, any deviation from the temperature at the point of the water coming into the pool would mean it was no longer warm. So let's move on to the second one, which would be the ultimate, which would have Mr. Fenn telling us the thermal spring temperature breakpoints that designate hot versus warm versus cold. But to my knowledge, Mr. Fenn has only said that warm means comfortable. The third option is if there is an authority that provides the thermal spring temperature breakpoints for us, kind of defines what's hot, what's warm, or the ranges of hot versus warm versus cold as it relates to thermal springs. All right. And what would be even better is if that authority would go ahead and put them on a map for us to take a look at. So if you Google NOAA thermal springs map, it'll bring up this. In fact, we can probably just click this right here and we'll pull up the thermal springs viewer, and now we can zoom in on all of the various thermal springs. And so you see from the temperatures here that warm shows up as yellow. We can click on that guy, and that's Rhodes Warm Spring. All right. Note that there are several in here that actually are named hot spring that show up as a warm spring. Here's another argument. But where in the mix does the water stop being warm? That's not precise enough. And I used to make this very argument as well. So the logical assumption that's the basis of this argument is that the warm or hot water flows out of the pool, the spring, and then it mixes with the cold water in the creek or in the river. My FLIR thermal camera showed me the error of my assumption. And what you're seeing right here, I can't tell if you can see these exact numbers, but what you have here is you have a line. These two pictures are the same, and I'm pointing the thermal camera here, and at this edge right here, I have 75-degree water. Okay, and then you see this clump of grass right here, and when I just move from here to here, guess what? my temperature goes from 75 to 45 in all of about, I don't know, a foot, maybe. The point is here, the warm water isn't flowing out into the river or the creek and then mixing at some indeterminate spot downstream and becoming less than warm. This water never leaves this pool at anything above about 45 degrees. So there's no outlet here, and the cold water is flowing into the warm pool, and therefore you don't have the scenario where you're trying to figure out where it mixes and becomes warm. If you accept the premise that 75 degrees is warm and 45 degrees is not warm, then we have a very defined edge in this particular scenario. Forrest Fenn has said every word is placed there strategically. You can't ignore any of the nouns in that poem. Key thing here is he's talking about and putting focus on the nouns in the poem. Where warm waters halt is the first clue and also a starting place on the map. A noun is defined as a word other than a pronoun used to identify a class of people, places, or things. Or in our case, in the poem, halt is being used as a noun. And as a noun, halt is defined as a suspension of movement or activity, typically, meaning more often than not, a temporary one. What we can draw from this is a conclusion with a good degree of confidence that halt is used as a noun in the poem, and therefore it is highly probable that where warm waters halt should be interpreted as where warm waters temporarily stop flowing. Well, take a look at this picture here. This pool is a hot spring in the Rocky Mountains that, by that NOAA website that we just looked at, it's considered to be a warm hot spring. So it's within that temperature range as defined by NOAA. So let me ask you this, just looking at this picture. Don't the warm waters in this pool temporarily stop flowing, like downstream, until they eventually go over the edge of the pool, flowing once again? Unless we're talking about an endorheic, like an endorheic basin or lake, the water here is almost always going to be flowing downstream with gravity through a canyon. All right, so you know the drill. Please hit the thumbs up, hit that little bell so you can get notice whenever I post a new video. Please comment, subscribe, etc., etc. Up next, I'm going to put my take on the 9 logical clues. So look for that. Until then, Matt Brewer signing off.